I'm going to be honest, I'm humbled. I mean, you talk about trying to follow somebody on stage, let alone those four individuals, because I was not planning on talking about democratizing artificial intelligence or the future of sex. I'm going to be honest, that was not on the agenda. So we could take it during Q&A, but quite frankly, though, if there's anybody in the room who can come up with a pill for jet lag, let me know. We'll arrange financing immediately. So that's really ultimately what I'm here to talk about, because what's possible? Well, I want to talk to you about where's the money flowing, and quite frankly, who are you competing with? What other technologies? Because ultimately, that's the game. Healthcare is a $7 trillion global industry. And as you're going to find, I approach things very much from a top-down perspective. So if there were a private equity person or an investment banker up here on the stage, or a research analyst, you would hear about the bottoms up and about how you make that company or that technology the most valuable. I come at it from the entire opposite direction. I start with the $7 trillion. I start with the fact that data and analytics, theoretically speaking, could save 20 or 30 billion dollars in drug development. And I start from the fact that in the future, we just heard a lot about FDA approvals and the individual who did not approve a single drug. That's not where we should be going in the future, obviously. We don't need the drug to be safe for everybody. And in a world where everybody has had their genome mapped, we don't need that. We can customize, right? So this is the number that I love. 51%. Because, look, I'm in finance. I like compounding. I'm not going to lie. That's the key. It's all about the compounding. Unless, of course, you're George Church and you make it the designer baby, in which case then it's not about compounding. That's pretty cool. But ultimately, he would tell you he's probably compounded also. 51%. 51% is the annual decline in cost of sequencing the human genome. Now, I know most of you know that. We started at what, 94 million, 96 million to do the first? And we're now down to a couple thousand. So let me put that in perspective. That would mean you bought a Mercedes-Benz that cost you $150,000 in 2001. You bought it for $130. $130. That's what fascinates me. That's why I'm here. That's why I think this community is really special. When we analyzed what the opportunity around this technology was, you start with 7 trillion, and then you have to start to break it down. And you have genomics. You have data and analytics, which, by the way, this is a tribute to both. And I think it's really important that we make sure not to separate that. Much of this cost decline, while part of it is due to biological advance, it's also due to computational advance. And then, of course, there's robotics, which we also consider part of artificial body parts. And then there's advances in microbiome. Ultimately, the segment that has proven to be the best investment so far is around data and analytics. And I know that's almost sacrilegious. It's not genomics. It's not microbiome. It's not the things we're doing in the lab. No, it's data and analytics. And the reason why, quite frankly, is it's asset light and it's scalable. So over the past 5 years, companies involved in data and analytics in this field have generally returned roughly around 20%. So for me, as an outsider, trying to identify opportunity, that's really attractive. Now, on the flip side of that, because that's been consistent, that has run somewhere between 16 and 20% pretty much every year. Companies involved in the microbiome space have been far more volatile. Over 5 years, you return negative 2%. Last year, however, you got 34%. So there's a much bigger swing. If we're looking at fund flows and we're looking for consistency and we're looking to build for the future from an investment perspective, understanding that is really key. A venture capitalist will stand here and their job is to seed and hope that 1 out of 10 hits. That's not my job. My job is to make sure nothing fails. So what's working right now in the marketplace, quite frankly, and I don't think this is surprising, because we look across these technologies, and then we look across, quite frankly, what's killing people. And then across different stages, prevention, diagnosis, and treatment. Genomics in the space of oncology and endocrinology is proving tremendously valuable. Much of the advances in microbiome are in gastroenterology, which I don't think is a surprise to most. And then if we think about robotics and data, which are starting to cut across all those different areas, ultimately that's where we see the fusion across those 4 technologies. So as we have thought about where is there future opportunity for our investors, at the end of the day, that's my job. I'm the guy who wakes up on a Saturday morning, finds my son watching TV, he's 8 years old at the time, watching TV, playing a game on his iPad with friends remotely, and, I didn't know this was possible, watching Netflix minimized in the upper right-hand corner. I'm the guy who stands there for a minute, thinks to himself he's probably not doing any of those 3 activities all that well, but then realizes he's consuming 3 different revenue streams at the same time. So I want to remind you that's where I'm coming from here. So if we want to talk about what's possible, we should also think about beyond this room, beyond tremendous advances that are happening, who are you competing with? Because ultimately, that's a constraint on what's possible. And I can tell you, there are 3 technologies that people want to talk about before they want to talk about this. And I love this, actually. I think this is ground zero. I think this is democratizing AI, the end of sex, whatever context we want to put on it. This is fascinating. And this is the future. And it might well be genetic computers wind up being better than quantum computers, or more feasible. But I can tell you out in the marketplace, when I talk to investors, the first thing I hear about is artificial intelligence. The second thing I hear about, and I'm sorry to say, it's 5G and communications technologies like social media. And then the third is cybersecurity, which I also think, by the way, might turn out to be a genetic dynamic, because if you think about one of the reasons why computers are so vulnerable, it's because they have the exact same code. What prevents disease from spreading is the fact that we all have different code. And that's a security system. So I actually think all of those areas could learn from what we're talking about. But from a practical standpoint, and I'm sorry to have to say this, but it comes number 4 on the question list. And I'm going to suggest to you that there are 4 reasons why. And this is something to take back, something to think about as you develop. I think there are a lot of people in this room who are going to understand when I say the mother test. So for all of us who got PhDs, at some point in the process, hopefully you had an advisor or a senior fellow student who informed you that you need to be able to explain what you're doing to your mother. Now, I realize, and I do not want to be pejorative, there are a lot of mothers in this room, and there are probably a lot of people who have mothers that are microbiologists and brilliant people in this room. So let me just put that out there. But nonetheless, the mother test. Can you explain what you're doing? Can you do it in simple language? Because, and this gets to number 2, the degree of expertise that people feel like they need to access this sector is really, really high. For whatever reason, we have programmed ourselves that we think artificial intelligence is pretty straightforward. Of course it's not. It's a term from the 1950s. It's silly. We should call it cognitive technology and move on, right? Because it's about cognitive automation. Physical automation, that we understand. Don't pick something up, use hydraulics to do it instead. But we can explain that simply. And you don't need the degree of expertise to do it. The industry is also very fragmented. As I said, healthcare, it's $7 trillion. It's a $96 trillion global economy. $7 trillion of it is spent on healthcare. So identifying very, very clearly and upfront what space people are in, that's really critical. And again, that gets to communication. The 4th, which we all grapple with. I'm going to hope there's no compliance people in the room. I work in a very, very regulated industry. And everything I say is very, very carefully designed. And this is a very, very regulated industry. And I actually tell investors, I think some of the most interesting, particularly in the field of public medicine, advancements are not going to happen here. They're going to happen abroad. A, because there isn't the degree of regulatory risk or regulatory requirement. But B, there's a demand. We have a massively expensive healthcare system. But it's a system. When you go to places abroad, there might not be a system. So the tablet technology in India, where you can get, 34 medical tests done for the equivalent of $5 to $10, that cost a few thousand in the United States, that to me is fascinating. And I think that that's tremendous opportunity. Now, a lot of the big advances will come out of this room, will come out of this city, and will come out of the US. But we should be thinking about healthcare on a global level, because that allows us to potentially break free of some of the regulatory burdens. And I think the healthcare industry is massively undervalued here globally, but as long as we continue to have these geopolitical debates around these issues, that's going to persist. So I'm ultimately here to say I am a big believer in what all of you do. I'm a big supporter, and I encourage people all over the country to think about these technologies, and I'm just encouraging you to think hard about how you communicate what it is you're doing. Because that discussion around GMOs from the first question, that's the case in point. I want to spend $3 for my cancer-preventing corn. I'm not going to lie. So encouraging everybody here to think really hard about how they communicate, how they raise money, and how they position themselves. So I'm happy to take questions. I think we have a few minutes. And I know I'm not George Church. And I can talk about interest rates also, but I prefer not to. Well, thank you all. Oh, wait, there we go. Yeah, so artificial intelligence, largely around the Industrial Revolution. And so, theoretically speaking, over the next 20 years, there's $16 trillion of cost savings that businesses can achieve by just simply running more efficiently. And that doesn't mean less people, and I'm happy to get into that because I don't believe that, but that would effectively double corporate profit margins. So corporate profit margins have doubled over a period of 40 years. And we're forecasting that they double again over a period of 20 years. So that's a tremendous opportunity. Now, so much of that technology, though, I'm going to go back. I'm going to try and go back. So much of that technology filters into this. Because a lot of it's around the data, the analytics, the infrastructure. So that was number one. Number two is around communications, social media. So a lot of attention around 5G, which I don't know if that's warranted, but around, and again, this is, I'm sorry if I'm going to repeat myself, but it's around how we're communicating with each other, how we're interacting. And then the third is how we protecting those interactions, right? And that gets down ultimately to cybersecurity. We think about it as security holistically. So for me, if I were to rate where I think the opportunity is, I think it's around AI, medical technologies, and then everything else is a distant second, distant third, fourth. Yep. Yes.
How does the competition for investors' capital change based on where you are in the life cycle of your company, whether you're venture, private equity, public?
So there is quite frankly, a much larger pool of capital disproportionately larger pool of capital. So, and I will tell you my constraint when I build portfolios is I am not allowed to look at a company with less than $1 billion market cap. Now, there are people who specialize in the 100 to the $1 billion, and mind you, I represent a $2.5 trillion platform. So that's $2.5 trillion that some of it might go into venture capital, and I will work with those people, but I can't necessarily go out and pick those companies. Then you've got the people who are going to specialize between 100 million and $1 billion, and so ultimately it's an exponential increase is what I would tell you based on your life cycle. What public markets hate the most, and ultimately what financiers hate the most, is uncertainty. I hate to say that because we're in the uncertainty business. That's what we do. We're borrowing from the future. We can't know the future. So the more you can do to reduce uncertainty, which in a business where a single breakthrough could be absolutely defining. Nonetheless, when you're communicating with people, when you're communicating with investors, it's about reducing that uncertainty. Well, thank you all very much for your time.